The chain went at 1:47 in the afternoon on the 14th of August, 1979. I felt it more than heard it, a change in the trailer's balance the moment a binder let loose, and by the time I had the truck stopped and my boots on the gravel, 3 logs had rolled off the back end and gone down into the brush on the low side of the road. That was when I heard the sound coming from under them. I was home in Forks, Washington by 6 that evening, but what showed up in the tree line behind my house at 2 in the morning, and what kept coming back for 22 years after that, was the part I did not see coming. Before we get into it, let me know where you are watching from and if you have ever had an encounter like this. My name is Floyd Reed. I was 27 years old that August, and I had been driving log trucks in Clallam County, Washington, since I was 19. Not highway rigs, not the flat country long haul you see moving freight between cities on the interstate. The real work, the kind that happens on single-lane gravel roads, cut into the sides of mountains, steep enough that a loaded truck going down uses the engine brake more than it uses any speed. Roads without guardrails and without painted center lines and with a drop on the low side that you stopped measuring with your eyes after about your second week on the job, because measuring it served no purpose except to confirm a number you did not need confirmed. 50 feet, 100 feet, sometimes more, depending on where in the drainage you were and how the road had been cut into the slope. You noted it once, filed it, and after that, you drove as though the drop were an engineering fact rather than a personal concern, which is the only way to drive in timber country and stay in timber country long enough to retire from it. I grew up in Forks. In 1979, and for most of the decade before that, Forks, Washington sat at the northwest corner of the Olympic Peninsula, surrounded on nearly every side by some of the densest, oldest forest on the continent. The Olympic National Park boundary cut through the timber just a few miles east of downtown, and to the north and west, the forest gave way eventually to coast, but the human settlement in between was always timber from front to back. Pope and Talbot held private timberland through much of the lowland and mid-elevation terrain. The National Forest wrapped the higher ground. Weyerhaeuser held sections east and south, and in the middle of all of it sat Forks, which by my best estimate in the summer of '79 had a population somewhere around 3,000 people, and among those 3,000 people, there was not one family I knew of that did not have some member whose hands had touched a chainsaw, a choker cable, a log loader, or the steering wheel of a truck on a logging road. It was that kind of place. It had been that kind of place for 2 generations before mine, and nobody I grew up with expected it to be anything else. The work shaped the place in ways that went beyond the economy of it. Timber country in that era had a specific material reality to it that was hard to explain to people who had not grown up inside it. The equipment was immense, the loads were immense. The roads were built to handle weight that would collapse most roads in the rest of the country, and yet all of it was being conducted on the edge of conditions that could change in hours and on terrain that had no mercy for mistakes. A man who drove a log truck for enough years developed a specific kind of attention to the physical world, a constant low-level assessment of everything around him: road surface, load stability, weather coming in off the ridge, the condition of his equipment, the position of other trucks on the road. This attention did not turn off when you left the truck. It became how you processed the world, and it produced a kind of person who was careful and observant and not given to drama, because drama was a luxury the work did not support. The social structure in Forks in those years was built almost entirely on this shared reality. People from outside the timber industry sometimes found the community hard to read. The reserve, how conversations between timber workers consisted largely of information and very little sentiment. The shared assumption that what needed to be done would be done without a lot of commentary about the doing of it. I grew up inside that culture, and I understood it from the inside. which meant I also understood its limits and its particular forms of care, the check-in when a truck was running late that sounded like a logistics inquiry but was not, how a crew reorganized itself around a man who was having a hard season without making a point of the reorganization. The care was real. It was just expressed in the vocabulary of work rather than the vocabulary of feeling. And if you knew how to read that vocabulary, you were never in any doubt about it. The work shaped the place in ways that went beyond the economy of it. You could read a family in Forks from the state of their truck and their tools, the same way you can read a fishing family from their boat and their nets, because the equipment was what stood between a man and his ability to do the work, and the work was what stood between the family and everything else. My father kept his truck immaculate, not for show, not out of vanity, but because a breakdown on a grade with a full load was a situation that could end in ways that a clean truck and properly maintained equipment were the first defense against. He checked his tires every morning before he left the yard. He checked his binders and his chains before he took a load. He was the same man at the end of 30 years of driving that he had been at the beginning, which is to say, careful, which is to say, still alive, which in that work were the same thing. My father drove truck. He drove for the same contractor he had started with at 19, and he retired from it at 62 with hands like tooled leather and a hearing loss from years of engine noise that he managed by tilting his right ear toward whoever was talking. His name was Earl Reed, and he had an opinion about every logging road in Clallam County and the nearby counties too, and he shared those opinions whether you needed them or not.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby, so if you want to check it out, link's down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
He had started in the industry at 19 in a period when the equipment was less reliable and the roads were worse and the safety knowledge was minimal, when men routinely drove in conditions that would have shut down an operation in later decades. He had seen things in those early years, losses among men he had worked with, situations that had gone wrong in ways that were irreversible. He did not talk about these things directly, but they shaped him as exposure to consequence shapes a person, and that shaping was visible in everything he did behind a wheel. He did not take chances. He did not assume the road was going to be what it had been the last time he drove it. He did not trust good weather to hold, or dry roads to stay dry, or loads to stay stable just because a loader had said they were stable. He trusted what he could verify, and he verified everything he could reach. This was not timidity. A man who drove fully loaded down grades that dropped 100 feet to the drainage below was not timid by any standard. It was of another order, a recognition that the environment he worked in was indifferent to him, and that the only protection he had was the quality of his attention. He passed this recognition to me not through instruction, but through repetition, through 8 years of watching him work, and by the time I sat behind the wheel of my own truck, it was already part of me. I grew up listening to him describe the characteristics of particular grades, how a certain corner on the Calawa Road would pull your front wheels wide if you came in 2 miles per hour too fast, how the Hoh River Road went soft in October before the frost, but after the first heavy rains, the stretches where the road was cut on bad material that moved every few years and gave you a new problem in the same location you thought you had learned. He described these things at the dinner table and in the truck, and sometimes in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely, because roads were how he understood the world, and everything else he thought about eventually came back to them. What I know about driving in timber country I know because he started teaching me before I had a license to drive anything, sitting me in the cab of his truck on a Saturday and letting me operate the gears on flat ground in the sort yard while he called out instructions from the passenger seat. By the time I was 14, I could drive a standard transmission without grinding it. By the time I was 16, I could back a trailer into a narrow space on the first try most of the time. By the time I was 18, I had spent enough hours watching my father work a loaded truck down a grade that the mechanics of it were natural to me. The weight shifting through the curves, the engine brake and service brakes working together, reading the road a quarter-mile ahead, and preparing for what was coming rather than reacting to what was already there. He never made a lesson of it. It was just what we did. He drove and I watched and he talked, and the watching and the talking became knowledge before I was old enough to know it was being accumulated. The roads in that country had their own logic, their own demands, and a man who drove them long enough stopped thinking of them as infrastructure and started thinking of them as terrain, the way a person stops thinking of a river as a crossing and starts thinking of it as a force with its own intentions. I got my commercial license the day after I turned 19 and called Gus Hartley from the phone in my father's kitchen to ask if there was a place for me. Gus had been my father's employer for 6 years by that point. He was a man of about 50 who ran a small but efficient operation out of a gravel yard on the south side of Forks. 4 trucks and 2 loaders and a set of haul contracts that kept his people working 6 days a week in the good months. He knew my father's work, which was as good a reference as existed in the industry in that county, and he knew that I had been around trucks since I was old enough to sit in one, and he said he would put me on after a 2-week orientation period where I ran empties on the roads he was using before he trusted me with a load. That was how Gus operated. He was patient, as men tend to become patient after they have seen what happens when someone gets impatient on a logging road. The year before I started, his best driver had put a loaded truck off the grade on the Calawa Road in wet November conditions. A wet berm, a moment of overcorrection, and then the low side and everything that followed. The man lived because the cab held and because the slope on that particular stretch was not as vertical as it was in other places. The truck did not survive in any useful form. Gus had rebuilt his operation around that loss and had decided that 2 weeks of unpaid orientation was a price worth paying for drivers who knew the roads before the loads made every decision consequential. I worked my way through the orientation and then through a season on a 20-year-old International with a tired engine that made a sound my father described without sympathy as the truck discussing its own mortality before Gus moved me to a white Western Star, and eventually, in the second year, to a Kenworth W900, a 74 model with a rebuilt Cummins engine that Gus had purchased at auction in Shelton and reassembled himself over a winter in his own shop. He had been a mechanic before he was a contractor, and he still preferred to know exactly what was in the machines his drivers depended on. That truck was the most reliable thing in my daily life for the next 6 years. I knew the sound it made at every operating temperature, the way the steering tightened in wet cold and loosened in summer heat, the vibration that came through the seat on the long straightaways and the different vibration that came through when the load was riding high. A man who drives the same equipment over the same roads for years develops a knowledge of that equipment that goes beyond anything mechanical. It becomes personal. The truck told me things through my hands and my spine and my seat, and I had learned to listen. Connie, the Olympic Peninsula in 1979, was a place that had not yet been discovered by the rest of the country as it eventually would be. The national park drew some visitors, and the coast drew some visitors, but the interior of the peninsula, the drainage country and the logging roads, and the small towns like Forks, was still largely the province of the people who had built their lives there. The timber families and the farming families and the fishing families and the people who had come from somewhere else and had stayed because the place had taken them in its specific way. There was a quality to the light on the peninsula that I have not found anywhere else. a quality of the latitude and the cloud cover and the way the ocean contributed its moisture to the air above the mountains, a diffused light that made the green of the forest seem to come from inside the trees rather than to be falling on them from above. On the rare, clear days in summer, the light was bright and hard, and the mountains to the east were visible in a clarity that surprised you, as though someone had turned a setting up that you had not known was there. The rest of the year the light was softer and the mountains were usually in cloud, and the forest lived in the middle distance between the clouds above and the wet ground below, and that middle distance was where I had spent most of my life. Connie had grown up in that same middle distance. Her family had been in Clallam County since the early years of the century, her grandmother having come from eastern Washington as a young bride, and having found the peninsula strange and large, and eventually, over decades, her own. Connie had her grandmother's letters in a box in the closet, letters written to a sister back east, describing the rain and the forest, and the particular quality of a life lived in close relationship with timber country, and Connie had read those letters enough times to have certain passages memorized. She quoted them sometimes, usually when she was thinking about what the letters helped her understand, the way certain people use old words as tools for current thinking. She took history seriously, not as a collection of facts about the past, but as a record of how people had responded to the conditions they were in, which she thought was the only kind of information that was genuinely transferable between one time and another. And I had been married 6 years that August. She was Connie Caldwell before she was Connie Reed, from a family that had been in Clallam County longer than most roads had been paved, and we had grown up 2 blocks from each other without being particularly close until a Tuesday evening in 1971, when we happened to end up at adjacent stools at the counter of a diner in Forks, and had a conversation that lasted 3 hours about nothing specific and everything important. She had a way of following a thought until it arrived somewhere, not aggressively, not combatively, but with a persistence that came from genuine interest rather than the need to be right. I had never met anyone who actually arrived somewhere in a conversation, rather than circling back to where they started, and by the time the diner closed around us, I was aware that I did not want the conversation to end. We had been married inside a year. Our house sat on 2 acres on the east side of town, backed up to a stand of second-growth Douglas fir that climbed the slope toward the ridge. We had a small barn that I used as a shop, a garden that Connie managed with considerably more success than I managed anything within my jurisdiction, and a 1/4-acre field between the house and the tree line that stayed green 10 months of the year because the peninsula rain made everything green 10 months of the year. I want you to tell you something about Connie before I go further, because she is part of this story in ways that are not incidental. She was a practical woman, not given to drama, not inclined toward easy answers, and possessed of a quality that she described as trying to look at what was actually there, rather than what she expected to find. She had a patience with evidence that I had not often seen in people, the patience to let evidence accumulate before drawing a conclusion, and the willingness to change the conclusion when the evidence required it. She worked part-time at the Forks Community Library, which suited her because she was a reader and because libraries in small towns are repositories of information about a place that does not get into any formal record, the oral history that comes in attached to donated books and to the conversations of people who come in for quiet. She had grown up on the Olympic Peninsula, and she knew it as you know a place when your family has been in it long enough that the knowledge is inherited as much as acquired. She knew which way the ravens flew before a weather change, and she knew the difference between an alder that had been down for a year and one that had been down for 10 years by the state of the bark, and she knew the names in the language that certain parts of the drainage had carried before the English names replaced them, because those names were in the donated books at the library, and she had read those books the way she read everything, carefully, and with the intention of remembering what mattered. She did not believe in making the mountains smaller than they were. The route I had been running since early July of '79 was the Sol Duc main line. The Sol Duc River runs out of the Olympic Mountains westward through Clallam County, draining the north side of the range and flowing south of Forks before joining the Quileute system near the coast. The lower valley has farms and cleared land and flat ground where the river has been running long enough to deposit good farming soil, but above a certain elevation the forest closed in and stayed closed. The big Sitka spruce and old Douglas fir and red cedar that had been growing on those slopes since before the first sawmill in the county. Trees that had been there when the first roads were cut and were still there after those roads had been paved and eventually abandoned. The Sitka spruce on the lower slopes, down near where the river ran cold and the fog came in off the coast, were the biggest trees I had ever driven beside. The bases wider than my truck was long and the first branches higher off the ground than some buildings in Forks. The old Douglas fir on the mid-elevation slopes were smaller in circumference but older in feeling, darker in the canopy, the bark so thick and deeply furrowed on the biggest of them that you could press your arm into one of those furrows to the elbow. The red cedar in the wet places near the creek drainages had a presence that the other trees did not have, a quality of the color of the bark and the way the lower limbs swept outward and downward, something that made you aware of them as individuals rather than as forest. Pope and Talbot held private timberland in a side drainage north of the main river, a section that had not been touched since the 1940s when the previous cutting had come through, and they had brought in a high lead yarder to take out a section that had been on their books for years, waiting for the market and the equipment and the road conditions to line up. The logs came down by cable to a landing on a ridge spur, and my job was to get to the landing, take a load from the loader, and haul it down to the sort yard in Forks. On a good day with dry roads and a loader running clean, I could do 2 full runs and sometimes the beginning of a third before the light got too flat for safe grades. The road up to the landing followed the Sol Duc Road east from Highway 101 north of Forks, then turned up onto Forest Service Road 291 at a junction about 12 miles in from the highway. From the junction, the road climbed steeply through second-growth fir and then into older timber, the kind of forest that keeps the road in shadow most of the day and keeps the surface cool and relatively firm, even in the dry months because the canopy holds the moisture in the air and the root systems hold the moisture in the ground. After the junction, it was another 7 miles to the landing, the last mile and a half on a spur that Pope and Talbot had cut the previous year along the north face of a ridge. The spur was rough, cut quickly without much attention to long-term maintenance because Pope and Talbot had estimated 2 years of use before the section was cut out and the road would be left to return to brush. It ended at a bench of flat ground where the landing had been established, the logs staged in tiers, and the yarder running its cable down the hill below in a rhythm I had learned to read from the sound alone. In the years I had been running that road, I had seen what the Sol Duc drainage held in terms of wildlife. Elk in the lower meadows in early morning, sometimes a dozen or more, the bulls carrying their velvet-covered antlers in August and watching the truck from the edge of the meadow with the particular combination of wariness and confidence that elk managed. Black bear most springs on the new growth along the road cuts, the bears compact and purposeful, ignoring the truck unless it stopped and then disappearing into the brush in seconds. The marten in the older timber on the upper elevations, visible sometimes crossing the road at a run, the tail carried low and the body in that long undulating motion they had, the dipper working the creeks at every elevation, the small gray bird that walked into the current and fed on the stream bed as though the water were not there, I had driven that road in all the seasons and in most of the weathers that a Pacific Northwest drainage could produce, and I knew its wildlife as you know things you see regularly, not by studying them but by accumulating observation until the observation becomes knowledge. In the summer of '79, I had not yet had a reason to think that the Sol Duc drainage held anything I did not already know about. I was a log truck driver with 8 years of experience and a good truck and a contractor I trusted. And the road was the road, and the timber was the timber, and the work was the work. That is the state a man is in when the thing he has not considered announces itself to him. The man running the loader at the landing was called Dutch by everyone who worked with him, though his name was Harlan Kuipers. He was a big, quiet man, maybe 55 in the summer of '79, with a face that had been outdoors in Pacific Northwest weather for 30 years and showed it in the permanent weathering around his eyes and across his cheekbones, the skin the color of old cedar bark in the places where the sun had worked on it longest. He was a Dutch immigrant who had come to Forks in the 1950s under circumstances he did not discuss and had found work in timber and never left. The story I had been told by more than one person, and therefore probably mostly true, was that he had been a loader operator in the Netherlands before he immigrated, that he had come with skills and found a place for those skills and had stayed because the place suited him and because a man who is good at something and has a place to do it has most of what he needs. He spoke English that had been learned as an adult and refined over decades into something more precise and more economical than most native speakers managed, and he used this precision with the same care he used with the loader, applying exactly the right amount of force in exactly the right direction to get the intended result. He had operated loaders for nearly 20 years, which is a long time to spend doing something that requires constant spatial attention and an understanding of how weight and leverage behave in 3 dimensions. When the material you are moving weighs a ton or more and the machine you are operating has a reach of 40 feet. He had developed a precision in the work that was noticeable, even to people who did not have a professional reason to notice it. When Dutch loaded your truck, the logs were centered, the weight was distributed correctly, the chains ran at the angles that kept the load from shifting through the corners. He took 20 minutes longer than most loaders, but when he was done, you drove with a specific kind of confidence that came from knowing the load had been thought about rather than just placed. Gus once told me that Dutch's loads had never shaken out on the road in the 12 years he had been working with him, which in log truck terms is the equivalent of a perfect safety record. You understood what that meant if you had ever seen what happens when a load lets go on a grade. He talked while he worked. That was his habit, a low, continuous commentary on the logs and the timber and the equipment and the weather, delivered in the precise English he had built over 30 years. He had strong opinions about wood species, about the quality of old growth versus second growth, about what certain species of tree told you about the soil they grew in and the weather history of the drainage. He knew which cedars had come off a south-facing slope by the density of the growth rings, and which had come from the wet north faces by the color of the heartwood. He had opinions about equipment, about the maintenance practices of the various contractors who used the landing, and about the way the Forest Service managed the roads, which he described as adequate in summer and wishful thinking in winter. He had the particular directness of someone who had had to build a second language by hand, a word at a time, and who did not waste words he had worked that hard to acquire. On the morning of August 14th, I came up the spur at 6:15, and Dutch was already on the loader, with a turn of logs staged and ready. He had been at it since before first light, getting ahead of the heat. The morning was clear and dry, the peninsula having been unusually dry since the middle of June, and the firs on the south-facing slope across the drainage were already putting out that pitch resin smell that warm, dry weather draws from the timber, a smell that meant the sap was running high and the wood was stressed and the fire danger was genuine enough that Gus had put a radio call out to all drivers the previous week about smoking on the roads. The Stellar's jays were loud in the canopy above the landing, competing with the sound of the yarder running its cable down the hill. It was a good morning for hauling, the roads firm and dusty, the light coming over the ridge by the time I had the truck positioned for loading. Dutch worked through the load over the next 45 minutes, talking the whole time about a problem he was having with the left track on the loader, a guide wheel that was not tracking cleanly and would need attention before he put too many more hours on the machine. He staged the logs carefully, the heavy cedar butt cuts at the front of the trailer for best weight distribution, the hemlock and Douglas fir sorted by diameter and nested to minimize shifting, the smaller diameter pieces stacked tightly against the bunk stakes. He ran the chains himself and set the binders, the lever-type binders that were standard on most logging equipment at that point, cranking each one down until the chain rang tight under the handle. He walked the load when he was done, checking each binder by hand, running his boot along the edge of the bottom logs to feel for any gap between the log and the bunk. He was thorough in this as he was thorough in everything. When he was satisfied, he stepped back from the trailer and hit it with the flat of his hand, hard enough to produce a sound, and said the load was good, and to watch the corner at the creek. He meant the corner just below the junction with Forest Service 291, where the road bent around a tributary ravine in an S-curve, and the inside of the lower part had been chewed up by years of trucks clipping it on the way around. He had mentioned this corner before, and he would mention it again the next time I came up. It was the kind of corner that a loaded truck had to take slowly and on the correct line, and the correct line was not the intuitive one, because the camber of the road at the apex of the curve worked against you, tilting the load toward the low side at the moment when you were already carrying speed from the grade above. Dutch knew every nuance of that road from years of driving it himself before he moved to loader operation, and when he reminded you about a corner, you noted it and did not forget. I left the landing at 11:15, or close to it. A shorter truck had gone ahead of me by about 20 minutes, which was how we managed the descents when multiple trucks were loaded at the same time. Spacing on a single-lane road was the difference between a smooth run and a situation where one driver had to back up a quarter-mile to a turnout to let the other pass, and on a steep grade with a full load, backing up was a situation worth avoiding if it could be avoided. I let the 20 minutes run out sitting in the cab with the engine at idle, watching a pair of ravens working the thermal above the landing and thinking about nothing in particular. Then I verified my mirrors, checked the binder tension one more time with a walk around the trailer, and pulled out onto the spur and started down. The first mile and a half off the landing was the spur itself, rough going, 2 ruts with young alder and fireweed growing in between them, where the machine traffic had not suppressed the brush enough to keep it down. The Kenworth crawled it in low gear, the load's weight settling into the trailer bunks, with a solidity that told me the load was centered and stable. Dutch had done his work. I checked my mirrors at the curves, and the load was flat and motionless. The chains all running at the correct angles, not a binder handle vibrating loose. I did not relax exactly, because relaxation is not the right word for the state. A driver is in on a grade, but I was settled. At the junction with Forest Service 291, I turned downhill and began the main descent. From the junction, the road dropped for about 2.5 miles before it eased on the shoulder of the ridge. That section was where the work was. The grade was steep enough that in low gear, descending, the weight of a full load pushed against the tractor with a constant low pressure, the loaded trailer behind acting like a force that wanted to push the whole rig faster than the road allowed. The engine brake kept it managed, a deep mechanical sound that carried through the cab and through the seat and through the bones of your hands on the wheel, and I held the speed steady and watched my mirrors and my road ahead simultaneously, the way you do when both demand equal attention. The trees along that section of road were second growth, for the most part. 40-year-old Douglas fir with some big red alder on the low side, where the slope let water gather, and between the firs and alders the sword fern stood shoulder-high in the wet pockets and knee-high on the drier ground. Midday in August, the light barely reached the road surface through the canopy, and on the low side of the road, the descent into the brush below was shadow all the way down. I had driven that stretch 200 times or more. I knew each curve by its feel through the steering wheel, as much as by its look through the windshield. The slight change in the grade angle before each corner, the crown of the road rising and falling in a pattern my body had memorized before my mind had bothered to think about it. The first mile below the junction was clean, load riding well, chains holding, the trailer tracking through the curves without pushing wide. I had made this exact run enough times that most of it was automatic in the sense that the right inputs came without having to consciously generate them. This is what years of repetition produces, a kind of road sense that lives below conscious thought and is more reliable for being there than it would be if it required thinking. You are doing the thinking for the things that have not happened yet, for the situations you have not seen before, and the body is handling the road you already know. I had made the same run on the same road over 100 times by that summer. I knew the descent the way you know a route you have driven enough times that it has become a kind of internal map. Not a conscious picture, but a series of sensations and responses that come in a specific order. The slight tightening of the curve a half-mile below the junction, the brief flat where the road crossed the old skid road cut, the long left-hand arc above the creek drainage where you needed to be in third and not trying to get back to second because the downward momentum did not allow for a clean shift at that point in the grade, the straight below that arc where the road ran along the contour for about 300 feet before bending right and dropping again. Each of these features had its own set of appropriate responses, and my body produced those responses before my mind articulated them. This is the part of timber driving that the people who have never done it do not understand from the outside, and that the people who have done it for years are hard-pressed to explain: the degree to which the work happens below the level of conscious decision. You are not deciding to check your left mirror in a certain curve. You are simply checking it, because that curve is the curve where the left mirror is what matters, and the years have made that so. You are not deciding to ease off the throttle before the grade steepens. The foot comes off the throttle because the grade is coming and the foot knows it. The thinking is happening, but it is happening in a substrate that is older and faster and more reliable than the part of the mind that produces language and reasons about things. In a crisis, that is the substrate you depend on, and in the years I had been driving that road, that substrate had become very well trained. Coming down through a left-hand curve 1.5 miles below the junction, onto a brief straight before the road bent right again, I felt it. Not in the steering, not in the brakes, in the weight behind me, a change in the balance of the load, slight and specific as a loaded trailer changes when one section of chain lets go its tension, not a slow drift, not a gradual shift. The sudden redistribution that comes when a constraint has failed and the material under the constraint begins to find its own position. My left mirror confirmed what my body had already told me. The top logs on the left front section were in motion. I put the brakes on in a controlled reduction, not a panic stop, because a panic stop with a shifting load on a grade is how you convert a manageable problem into a catastrophic one. Steady pressure, bringing the speed down while keeping the trailer tracking straight, watching for the wide point in the road that I knew was about 40 feet ahead on the right side, a natural turnout in the road, cut where the hill had been opened up enough to give a truck room to breathe. I brought the rig into the turnout over 150 feet and set the parking brakes and shut the engine down. The silence after the engine cut was the specific silence of those mountains that comes in when the mechanical noise stops, not quiet but the full sound of a forest in August, the jays above the canopy, the creek sound from far below the road, the dry rustle of fir branches in a small wind off the ridge. I sat in that silence for about 3 seconds, which is not a long time but is long enough to let the senses reset, and then I got out. When I walked back to the trailer, I found what I had known I would find. 2 binders on the left front section had let go. One was hanging loose from the chain, the handle dangling against the stake. The other had come completely off and was somewhere on the road behind me. The logs in that section had shifted left and downhill during the curve, and 3 of them had gone over the low side of the road. The large hemlock, a butt section about 4 feet through and 11 or 12 feet long, had taken the left front stake with it, bending the stake but not breaking it off clean. The remaining load had shifted but was still contained on the bunks. I looked over the edge. The slope dropped at a steep angle into a stand of red alder and vine maple, with sword fern covering the ground so thickly you could not see the soil beneath. The logs had gone through the brush in a trail of broken branches and torn fern, moving fast on the slope before they stopped. I could see the trail they had made clearly, the broken alder stems and the fern pressed flat and the dark soil showing through where the hemlock had dragged across it going down. But I could not see the logs themselves. They had gone far enough down the slope that the brush had closed back over them. I looked at that trail for a moment. Then I heard the sound from the bottom of it. I have spent 45 years trying to find the right words for that sound, and what I have settled on is this. It was produced by something alive. It had a quality that told me the something was in pain, and it had a pattern to it that was not random. Short pulses, low in register, spaced at intervals that were too consistent to be involuntary. I ran through the catalog my years in the timber had given me. Deer sounds, bear sounds, coyote, cougar, everything native to the drainage, and nothing matched. Not the pitch, not the cadence, not the quality of the sound itself, which had in it a modulation I associated with intentional vocalization rather than pure reflex. The failure of that catalog to produce a match was itself a piece of information, and I stood on the road for a moment with that piece of information and let it settle before I went back to the truck and got the peavey from the toolbox behind the cab and the come-along from behind the seat. Then I went over the edge of the road and down the slope. The going was steep enough that I needed both hands, one on the peavey for balance and one reaching for alder trunks to control my descent. The sword fern was deep enough to hide the ground below it, and the soil under the fern was loose and dark, good forest soil that gave under my boots in the manner of something that was not quite stable. The smell of it came up rich and green even in the August heat. The smell of disturbed ground and wet wood and decades of accumulated forest floor. The smell of old things broken open by a fast-moving force. I worked my way down 30 feet and found the hemlock. It had come to rest in a shallow depression where the slope leveled slightly, its butt end buried in the ferns. The first fir had come down beside it, parallel, about 4 feet away. The second fir was 10 feet further down, hung against a big red alder whose root mass had caught it. Both firs had broken branches on the way down, and the alder they had hit had lost some bark at the impact point, the pale inner wood showing through. The clearing that the logs had made in the fern was still settling, a few broken stems still moving in the slight wind. Between the hemlock and the first fir, I found the source of the sound. I am going to describe what I saw as carefully as I can, because this is the part that everything else depends on, and the part I have tested most thoroughly against the possibility that I was wrong about it. I was not wrong about it. I have examined the memory too many times and from too many angles over too many years to believe that what I saw was anything other than what it was. It was roughly the size of a child of 10 or 11 years, but the proportions were not right for a human child, and I registered that immediately, not as a conclusion I reached, but as a perception that arrived before any thinking happened. The shoulders were too wide. The arms were too long relative to the torso, the forearms especially, and the hands at the ends of those arms were outsized, each finger thick at the base and the knuckle structure heavy and prominent. The kind of hands that looked made for work in the way that tools look made for work rather than hands built for something other than carrying small things carefully. The hair covering it was a medium brown, not uniform, darker along the spine and at the shoulders, and lighter at the belly and the inner arms, the color of fir bark after several days of rain, and it was about 2 inches long over most of the body, matted and pressed flat, in places where the log had come down on it. The left leg was pinned under the hemlock. The log lay across the lower part of the left leg at about calf level, and the condition of the ground around it, the torn fern and the churned soil, told me it had been trying to pull free before I arrived. The effort had not been successful and had apparently been abandoned, the body gone still with a considered stillness that was not defeat but conservation, the stillness of a conscious thing managing its resources in a situation it could not immediately resolve. It was looking at me, and I want to be precise about this because it is the detail that changed everything about how I understood what I was dealing with. It was not looking at me as a wounded wild thing looks at a person approaching. It was looking at me the way a conscious thing looks at something it is trying to assess, bringing attention that was specific and directed and layered, the attention of a mind that was evaluating rather than simply reacting. Behind the attention there was composure. It was in pain and it was afraid, and it was managing both of those things actively in order to look at me carefully and decide what I was. The eyes were amber, nearly gold, set under a brow ridge that was heavier and more pronounced than any human forehead I had seen. The face was broad, the nose wide and flat, the jaw substantial, not a human face, but a face that belonged to something that relied on a face the same way a person does, as an instrument of communication and perception, as the part of the body turned toward what mattered. I stood still. I stood still for what I later estimated was 15 or 20 seconds, long enough to get my own breathing under control, and long enough for whatever was on the ground to reach some conclusion about what I was going to do, because after those seconds the pulsed sounds from the brush went quiet, not because the pain had stopped, because it had decided to be quiet while it read me. I took one step forward. The free leg contracted immediately, the foot digging into the soft soil, the body weight shifting to set up for whatever escape it could manage. I stopped, waited. The tension held, not released, but not escalating. I said in my normal voice and not raised, "I am not going to hurt you." I said it because it was true and because saying it out loud steadied a part of me that needed steadying. Whatever value the words had to what was on the ground, the body on the ground stopped preparing to push away when I said them. Some tension in the posture released. Not all of it. Enough. I assessed the situation with the hemlock. The log was 1,100 pounds, or better in that section, resting in a depression in the soil with the full weight distributed across the pinned leg and into the ground around it. The peavey alone was not going to move it. I needed the geometry of the come-along to give the peavey a chance. I ran the come-along cable around the downhill side of the hemlock and hooked it to the standing red alder below, the one that had caught the second fir. The alder was 8 inches through and rooted on the uphill side of its base, which meant it was braced against the direction I needed the log to go. I tested the tension. The cable went tight. The alder held without moving. All of this took 8 or 10 minutes of working around the log, moving in the space between the hemlock and the first fir, passing within a few feet of what was pinned on the ground. During the whole time, it watched every move I made. It tracked the cable going around the log. It tracked my hand setting the hook. It tracked the angle of my body when I tested the tension. It watched as a person watches something they are trying to understand, not with fear, but with concentration. And during the whole time I worked, it did not try to pull free again. A thing in pain and a thing afraid does not stop trying to escape unless it has given up or it has found a reason to wait. What was on the ground in front of me had apparently found a reason to wait. Once the come-along was set and the cable tight, I positioned the peavey on the uphill side of the hemlock, set the hook into the bark as high up the log as I could reach while maintaining leverage, and put my weight into the handle. The first attempt moved the log maybe an inch, not enough to help and enough to change the pressure on the pinned leg. The sound from the ground was immediate and sharp, a short, high vocalization of pain that I felt somewhere behind my sternum. I stopped, adjusted the peavey hook higher on the log where I could get a longer lever arm, and began ratcheting the come-along simultaneously to take up any remaining slack. The second attempt moved the hemlock 8 inches. It came up off the depression in the soil and rolled to the downhill side, the full weight transferring to the come-along cable, and the leg came free. I heard it happen in the change of the cable tension and in the log settling into its new position on the downhill side, and I held the peavey where it was until I was certain the log was not going to roll back. The thing on the ground went still. Then it pushed itself up. The shoulder came off the ground first, then the other, and it got to a sitting position and looked at its own left leg. It reached down with the right hand and ran the hand slowly along the leg from just below the knee to the ankle. A quality in that touch told me it was assessing the damage from the inside, as a person does when they are not sure how bad it is and are running a system check before they commit to standing. When the hand came away, a shift in the expression followed. The tightest lines around the eyes relaxed slightly. It tried to stand. The left knee buckled on the first attempt, and it went back to one hand on the ground. It tried again, slower, putting the weight on the right leg first, and then testing the left in stages. The left held on the second attempt, bearing weight with a slight adjustment in how the weight was distributed, the body leaning fractionally right to favor the good side. It stood at roughly 4 feet tall, maybe a fraction more, and the proportions that had seemed outsized when it was on the ground looked different upright, where the longer arms and broader shoulders made their own sense in a frame that was lean and young and not yet grown into its full dimensions. The medium brown hair along the shoulders was standing slightly away from the skin, as a dog's coat rises when alarm has moved through it, but not raised all over. Just at the shoulders and across the back. It looked at me for a long moment. Then it looked upslope, at the road above, and at the dark timber above and beyond the road. Then it looked at me one more time. The first look had contained fear and pain and assessment. The second look had changed. The fear was diminished. The assessment was still there. But underneath those two things, there was what I did not have language for at the time and have been working toward language for since. The closest I have gotten is this. It was a noting. One conscious thing noting that another conscious thing had done something that mattered, noting it without ceremony, without demonstration, as you note a fact. Not gratitude in any form I understood from human behavior, not an exchange, nothing transactional about it, a noting, and then it turned upslope. It moved through the brush with the left leg compensating for the injury in an adjustment I recognized because I had seen it in people. The hip rotating slightly to take the weight off the affected side, the arm on the same side staying closer to the body, the pace adjusted to accommodate the cost of each step. It used the alder trunks the way I had used them coming down. a hand on each one for support and control. I watched it go until the sword fern and vine maple closed back around it about 30 feet above where I stood, and then the hillside was quiet and still and showed nothing of what had been there. No movement in the fern, no sound. The August afternoon, the same as it had been before the chain went. I climbed back up to the road. The running board of the Kenworth was where I sat for what I later estimated about 10 minutes. My hands were doing the fine trembling that comes after adrenaline without an outlet, and I drank from the water jug I kept under the seat. I sat there in the shade of the cab and looked at the forest across the road and listened to it being a forest. August in the Sol Duc country, when the air is clear and dry and the pitch resin smell is in everything, is about as good as the world gets in terms of the senses, and I was aware of all of it in a specific way, the way you are aware of your surroundings in the minutes after the unexpected. The thoughts I had were practical ones at first: the load, the damaged binders, the bent stake, the 3 logs on the slope and how to retrieve them and what the retrieval would cost Gus. These practical thoughts kept me occupied for the first few minutes in the way that practical thoughts are sometimes useful for, giving the other kind of thinking somewhere to wait. Then I rebound the remaining load, replacing the failed binders from the spare set in the toolbox and tightening the chains on the sections that had shifted. I marked the location of the lost logs with a blaze on a roadside tree. I walked the load twice before I was satisfied. Then I got on the radio. Gus answered on the second call. I told him I had shed 3 off the left side, gave him the road mileage, and told him the remaining load was rebound and I was ready to bring it down. He asked if I was all right. I said yes. He asked about the truck. I told him about the bent stake. He said bring it in easy and they would sort out the retrieval in the morning. He did not raise his voice. Gus never raised his voice on the radio. I drove the rest of the haul down to Forks. The sort yard was quiet in the mid-afternoon. I scaled the load, got my ticket, and drove home. Connie had dinner going when I came through the back door. She looked at me and read what she read after 6 years of reading me, and she asked how the road was. I lost 3 off the load, I said, left side, about 1.5 miles below the 291 junction. Bent a stake. She put a plate in front of me and sat across the table and let me eat, without asking what else was on my mind. We ate dinner and listened to the weather report and watched the evening news. I went to bed at 9 and lay on my back looking at the ceiling and listening to the second-growth firs behind the house, moving in the evening air off the Pacific, and I did not sleep until past midnight. At around 2 in the morning, a sound woke me. It came through the open bedroom window from the direction of the field and the tree line. Low enough that I registered it in my chest before I registered it with my ears. A resonance that was not wind and was not any creature I knew from these hills. It rose slightly in pitch and then held for several seconds and then faded, then came back. A calling sound, if calling can be the word for it, directed from the trees toward the house. I got up and went to the window. The field was lit by an August moon 2 nights short of full, the grass silver white and the dew on it catching the light in small flashes. The tree line dark at the canopy but visible as a boundary. In the shadow of the trees, about 20 feet back from the field's edge, there was a shape. It did not move. It did not need to move to be visible because it was too large to be invisible in that space, even in that shadow. Upright, motionless, directed at my house. I stood at the window for 40 minutes. The shape was there for most of that time, producing the low sound at intervals of a few minutes. The sound had a quality I had not encountered in any living thing I knew of in that drainage, a depth that implied a chest cavity considerably larger than mine, and a control in the production of it that implied the depth was not an accident. When the shape finally went, it went quietly, without drama, and the tree line was just trees. I did not go outside. I did not wake Connie. I went back to bed. The second night was the same. Beginning around 1:30, I was already awake, lying in the dark listening for it. The shape was in the same position in the tree line, but this time after the first vocalization came a different sound, percussive and wood-deep, a knocking sound that was the sound of impact against a large hollow tree with a heavy branch. 3 times, spaced evenly, then silence, then 3 more, then silence again. I knew what anger sounded like. I want to say that clearly because it matters for everything that came next. Whatever was in my trees on those nights, the sound it was making carried anger in it. Not the wild, uncontrolled anger of a thing in pain, the lower and more controlled anger of a grieved thing, one that had come somewhere specifically to express that grievance, and was expressing it in a form it believed would be understood. Whether I understood it correctly, I cannot say with certainty, but the reading I put on it then, the reading that is held up across 45 years, was this. A young one had been hurt near where I worked, and its keeper had arrived at the place where I lived to say so. And it was saying so with the expectation that I would understand what was being said. On the 3rd night, I went outside. I put on my boots and my flannel, and I walked out the back door into the damp August air. The dew was heavy in the grass, the kind that soaks your boots in 30 feet, and I crossed the field at a measured pace, not fast and not slow, the pace of a man who knows where he is going and is going there without theater. I stopped about 60 feet from the tree line, far enough to give room, close enough to be clearly visible in the moonlight. I put my hands at my sides. The sound came from the trees. Up close, it had a quality that the window had filtered, a complexity in the harmonics, a resonance that was not a single pitch, but a layered thing, the fundamental note and the overtones above and below it. And the overall effect was a force I felt in my sternum and my collarbone and the back of my jaw. It was directed at me. Whatever was in the trees was producing that sound toward me, and the content of it, the quality underneath the acoustics, was about what had happened on the slope and about the uncertainty around what had happened on the slope and about having come to the place where I lived, because uncertainty was not acceptable. I let it finish. When it stopped, I said, I got the log off. I did not hurt it. I used a tool to move the log, and then it stood up and walked away. It was hurt, but it was walking. The forest was quiet for a long moment. Then one pulse, shorter and lower than what had come before, came out of the trees. Not agreement, not peace, a space between a question and a statement, held in suspension between the two. I turned and walked back to the house. I stood in the wet grass with my boots soaking through and looked at the tree line and let myself be in that situation without trying to resolve it into something it was not. This is harder than it sounds. The human mind wants to sort what it encounters into categories it already has, and when the sorting fails because nothing in the available categories fits, the mind defaults to the nearest available category, which is usually wrong. I had spent 3 nights watching what was in my tree line that did not fit any category I had, and I had spent those 3 nights resisting the pull toward the nearest available category, which was bear or elk, or some combination of natural events that could produce the sounds I was hearing if I was willing to stretch the definition of natural events far enough to make it fit. I was not willing to stretch it that far. The sounds were not bear sounds, and they were not elk sounds, and they were not any combination of natural sounds I had heard in 30 years in this forest. They were of another order, and what they were was in my tree line right now, and I was standing in the wet grass 60 feet from it, with my hands at my sides. The moon was behind a thin layer of cloud that night, the light diffused enough that the field was visible, but not bright, the tree line dark and the shadow under the canopy complete. The shape in the trees was visible not because the light revealed it, but because it was large enough and dark enough that it made a different kind of dark against the lighter dark of the understory. It was upright. It was still. It was looking at me with an attention I could feel at 60 feet, the same way I could feel it from 2 feet on the slope in August. The specific quality of being attended to by a presence that was taking information from looking at you and working with that information. I said what I said. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. A shift had occurred in the quality of the attention in the dark, the specific flavor of what was being directed at me across 60 feet of wet grass. And when the single pulse came out of the trees, it had in it a quality I had not heard before. Not anger and not greeting and not anything I had a word for, but something that felt like a concession, like a held door opening for a long time opening, fractionally, enough for air to pass through. Connie was in the bedroom doorway. She had heard the sounds through the open window, and she had heard me go out. She looked at me with the expression she used when she was ahead of a situation and waiting for someone else to arrive at the same place. "There is something in the tree line," I said. She told me she had heard the knocking 2 nights ago. I said yes. "Is it dangerous?" she asked. 3 nights, I said, and it has not done anything except make sounds, but it is angry. What I read as angry. What is it angry about? I told her then the whole thing, the slope and the sound from the brush, and what I had found under the hemlock, the peavy and the come-along, and the amber eyes and the second look before it went upslope. She listened through all of it without speaking. When I was done, she was quiet for a breath. Then she said she thought that was the mother. "Yes," I said. "That was what I thought." "She does not know you helped," Connie said. "She knows her young one came back hurt and came back near where you had been." "That is what I think," I said. Connie was quiet for a moment. Then she said we needed to help her understand that. We went back to bed. I did not sleep easily, but I came to bed. The visits continued through the rest of August and into September. The pattern was not every night, 2 or 3 nights in a cluster, then a gap of several days, then another cluster. The gap told me she had ground to cover between the Sol Duc drainage and my property, that this was not a permanent position she had taken up, but a repeated trip with distance in it. The consistency of the timing, always late, always in the same hours, told me she was choosing those hours deliberately, not arriving when she happened to arrive, but arriving when she had decided to arrive. The anger in the sound changed over those weeks. There were nights when the knocking came in hard, and the overtones in the vocalization were as sharp as they had been in the first nights. And those nights coincided with what I eventually identified as the presence of unknown vehicles at my property. A neighbor's truck in the driveway, the rural mail carrier on an off-day schedule. She was watching who came and went. She was tracking what my property looked like as a pattern, and disruptions to the pattern produced what I recognized as alarm. When no unknown vehicles were present and the evening was ordinary, the sound from the trees was lower and briefer, and the knocking did not come. I was paying close attention. This is the thing I had been trained to do since I was 19 years old, sitting behind a wheel on a strange road. Pay attention to what the road is telling you before it becomes a problem. What the tree line was telling me across those weeks of September was that whatever was in it was intelligent enough to observe a pattern and respond to variations in it. That was not instinct. That was not reflex. That was a state I had a word for but was not ready to use yet. In mid-September, I went to the Forks True Value and bought dried corn and dried apples and dried cranberries. I brought them to the tree line at dusk on a clear Saturday and set them at the base of the first large fir inside the canopy, 5 feet from the field's edge. I did not make ceremony of it. I put the food there and walked back to the house. In the morning, the bags were gone. Not scattered, not chewed through, not left in shreds. Taken intact. That night there was no knocking. The vocalization came, brief and low, and when I went to the window, The shape was there in the trees, and then it was not. I left food at the tree line 4 more times in September and early October. Each morning the food was gone. On the 5th morning I found an object at the spot, a strip of inner bark from a western red cedar, about 8 inches long, stripped clean of the outer bark. The inner surface, fibrous and pale, pressed into the surface of the bark, visible at an angle to the light, was a thumbprint. Ridge pattern clear, the pressure having pressed the fiber into a permanent record. The print was more than twice the size of my own thumb. I took it inside and set it on the kitchen windowsill. Connie found it when she came home. She held it up to the window and looked at it for a long time, turning it at different angles, running her finger across the surface without touching the print itself. Then she said I was doing the right thing, simply and without elaboration, as she said things when she had thought them through before speaking. I had not framed it as a right or wrong thing. I had framed it as a necessary thing, an answer to a situation I had not chosen but was in. But Connie was right that it was both. I want to try to give you a sense of what those months were like from the inside, because they were unlike any period of my life before or since, and the quality of them matters for understanding what came after. Every evening when I came home from work, my first action was to check the food spot at the tree line. Not to set food there, we had a schedule for that, but to see what had been left. On the mornings after a visit, I checked before breakfast, in the dark if it was late fall, with a flashlight when it was fully dark. Every morning there was nothing at the spot except the ground, the moss, and the alder leaves and the soil. And then, every few weeks, there was an object, a piece of bark, a stone worked in a specific way, something I had not put there. These mornings when an object was there had a particular quality that I have tried to describe before without fully succeeding. They were not dramatic. I did not shout or drop what I was holding or run inside to tell Connie. I stood and looked at what was there and sometimes picked it up and turned it in my hands and sometimes just looked at it for a while and then went inside. The drama was internal, and the internal drama was not excitement but a steadier quality, the accumulating weight of a situation that was not going to resolve simply, and that was asking me to develop a tolerance for complexity that I was not sure I had. I was a log truck driver. My professional life was built on clear problems with physical solutions. A chain that has let loose requires a new chain. A road that has washed out requires a detour. The situation at my tree line did not have the structure of a clear problem with a physical solution. It had the structure of a relationship, and relationships do not resolve, they develop, and developing them requires a different set of capacities than solving problems requires. I developed those capacities over the fall of '79, imperfectly and slowly. Connie was ahead of me in this, as she was ahead of me in most things that required patience with ambiguity. She had decided within days of finding out what was in the tree line that the situation was territory to be inhabited rather than resolved, and she inhabited it with the same steadiness she brought to everything she cared about. She was interested, not frightened, not thrilled, not performing equanimity that she did not actually feel. Interested, as she was interested in everything that was genuinely new and genuinely there. October came, and the peninsula went back to being itself, the dry summer ending in long, soft rain from the Pacific that came in and stayed for weeks. The roads got their clay back. The moss brightened on the fir trunks. The smell of the forest changed from dry pitch resin to damp bark and wet soil and green growing things. The smell that was the baseline of the place and always had been. I had been born into that smell, and every October of my life, when the rains came back, it was like the world resetting to the version of itself I knew best. The visits through October and November slowed to once a week, sometimes less. When they came, The quality of the sound was different from the first weeks. The anger was largely gone. What replaced it was not warmth and was not comfort. It was watchfulness, a presence that came and observed and left without making demands. I kept leaving food at the tree line roughly once a week, and every morning after a visit the food was gone and sometimes a response was left. A strip of bark, a pine cone with the scales worked in a particular way. Once a flat stone with a mark scratched into its surface in a pattern I could not interpret, but that was too regular to have been accidental. In January, I left a whole coho salmon. We had extra from the fall run, and I wrapped it in brown paper from the hardware store and put it at the base of the fur. In the morning, the salmon was gone, and in its place was a bundle of cedar bark, the inner surface stripped and cut in a spiral pattern. I showed the bundle to a man at the county extension office and told him I had found it on the property. He identified the preparation technique as associated with traditional practices in the region, a method for rendering cedar bark pliable for weaving. He said he was not aware of any active use of the technique in the Forks area. That bundle went on the kitchen windowsill next to the bark with the thumbprint, and Connie looked at both of them in the winter light and said that whatever was in the timber had a material culture. It knew things that had been taught rather than things that were instinctive, and that made it different from anything she had a framework for. In late December, Connie sat me down at the kitchen table and said she wanted to think out loud about what we were dealing with. She had been doing research at the library, reading everything she could find about behavioral patterns and large mammal nutrition and Pacific Northwest ecology. She had been thinking not about what we were dealing with, but about what we were trying to communicate, and whether the food alone was sufficient to communicate it. Food tells her you are not a threat, Connie said. People feed wildlife all the time, and it does not make them trustworthy. It makes them a food source. I asked what made someone trustworthy. Time, she said, and consistency, and not doing anything wrong when you had the chance. She is watching for that, I said. Yes. She is watching to see what you do when the stakes are low, because that is what you do when the stakes are high. I had not put it that way, but she was right. What was happening at my tree line was not a negotiation. It was an observation period. And whatever was being determined on the basis of accumulated evidence rather than a single gesture, however well intended. I thought about this through the winter months, through the snow that came and went in January, through the freeze in February that turned the field behind the house into a white plate that took the moonlight and held it. I thought about patience, about a being that had come to my tree line and started with anger and then converted that anger over weeks into a slower mode and more careful, because the slower and more careful thing was more useful for what needed to be determined. That level of patience implied a level of self-awareness and self-regulation that I had not been prepared to attribute to anything I had encountered in these mountains. And every time I tested that attribution against the evidence held. The winter of 79 into 80 was one of the harder ones on the peninsula in recent memory. Cold, and wet enough to keep Connie's garden covered in frost most of January, and kept me off the Sol Duc route for 2 weeks when the upper roads froze over and Pope and Talbot suspended hauling until conditions improved. During those 2 weeks, I had more time in the evenings than I usually had. I spent some of it in the shop, working on an engine I was rebuilding for no particular reason, except that I needed to occupy my hands. I spent some of it sitting at the back window, watching the tree line in the winter dark, which had become a habit in the way that any repeated action becomes a habit when you do it often enough. The visits through January and February came about every 10 days, always the same hours, always the same position at the tree line. The food left, the food taken, the response placed in the morning. In February, a piece of obsidian, shaped with a stone tool into a rough oval form, The edges worked in a controlled pattern that told me whoever had made it understood the material and what pressure in what direction produced what result. I kept that too. The winter of 79 into 80 gave me what I had not had before in my working life, which was time to think. The 2 weeks off the Sol Duc route, when the upper roads froze over, were not idle weeks. I was running other routes for Gus and doing shop work and managing the 100 small maintenance tasks that a property and a truck and a life in a small town generate. But the specific task of thinking about what was in my tree line had more space in those weeks than it usually did. I thought about the economics of the situation first, because that was how I was wired to think about things. What was it costing the being in the tree line to make these trips to my property and back? I had enough knowledge of the terrain between Forks and the upper Sol Duc to estimate the distance at between 8 and 12 miles in a straight line, and in terrain that required moving through mature timber and up and down ridge systems. A person in good physical condition could cover that distance in 4 or 5 hours in good weather on open ground. In old-growth timber at night over terrain that had no trail, the time would be longer and the effort would be considerably greater, and these trips were being made repeatedly, 2 or 3 times a week in the first months, which meant the investment of time and energy was substantial. Real cost was being spent to be in my tree line, and the fact that it continued to spend it after the first few weeks, when the simple hostility of the early visits had shifted into a more measured register and less emotionally urgent, told me that what it was getting from these trips was worth what it was spending. What was it getting? I thought about this for most of that winter. The food was part of it, but the food alone could not account for the investment. An 8 to 12 mile round trip for a bag of dried corn and apples repeated twice a week is a significant expenditure of energy for a modest caloric return, especially in winter when the energy cost of travel is high and the temperature makes every calorie matter more. The food was not the point, or not only the point. The information was the point. It was coming to my property to gather information that it could not gather from a distance. Information about me, about Connie, about who came and went, about what the pattern of my life looked like up close, about whether I was what I had seemed to be on the slope in August when I had done the thing with the peavy and the come-along. It was running a verification, and the verification was taking as long as it needed to take. This made sense to me more than most things about the situation made sense. Verification before trust. Trust not extended on the basis of a single action, no matter how positive that action had been, but earned through consistency over time. This was not a simple or instinctive thing. This was a considered approach to a situation where the costs of misjudging were high, which implied a being that understood the concept of cost and the concept of misjudging and the relationship between the two. I sat with this in the shop in January, working on the engine that did not need rebuilding, and I thought that whatever was in my tree line was, among other things, more careful than most people I knew. Spring of 1980 came late. The rains ran into April, the fern uncurling later than usual, the alder putting out its pale green under skies that stayed gray through most of the month. I went back to the Sol Duc main line in early March, running a different spur off Forest Service 291, about 3 miles from the landing I had worked the previous summer. The spur came off the main road near a stand of timber that had been thinned about 10 years earlier, 40-year-old Douglas fir with the canopy not yet fully closed, the light coming through in long columns between the trunks on clear days. I was empty running back up to the landing for a second load on a clear afternoon in late March, moving at road speed on the empty rig, when I came around a bend in the thinned stand and saw them. At the edge of the timber, roughly 50 feet back from the road, standing in the light between 2 large firs, there were 2 shapes, both upright. The larger one was tall, considerably over 7 feet, with dark brown hair that was nearly black in the column of afternoon light, silver showing at the shoulders where the light caught the longer hairs there. The smaller one stood well below the shoulder height of the larger, and even from a moving truck I could see the medium brown hair, lighter at the belly, and I could see that the weight between the 2 feet was not quite even. The left side was carrying slightly less than the right. 7 months. The leg was not entirely right, not yet, but it was walking. I slowed the truck as I went past the gap between those 2 furs, not to a stop. I let the rig slow to a crawl and I turned my head as I went by, and both of them were looking at the truck, the larger one looking with an expression I could not read at that distance. The smaller one with those amber eyes that I had last seen 2 feet away on a slope in August, looking at me from the timber with the same quality of attention they had held then. There is something I want to ask you about, because I have been asking it of myself for 45 years, and I still do not have a complete answer. Have you ever been looked at by a being in the natural world that made you feel you were being seen fully, not just your body, but the truth of who you were and what you had done? Because that is what I am trying to describe. A truck cab at a crawl, passing a gap in the timber, and 2 shapes in the light watching me go. Not running, not hiding, not pretending I was not there. Watching me go the way you watch someone you know. I have been asking whether I read that correctly for 45 years, whether what I felt in that moment, a recognition that moved in both directions, was projection or something that was actually there. 45 years of honest examination have not produced a reason to believe I was projecting. They saw me, and they let me see them seeing me. That is what happened at that bend in the road on a March afternoon in 1980, and I am as certain of it now as I was then. I sat in the cab for 5 minutes at the landing before Dutch came over and knocked on the glass. Dutch asked if everything was all right. I told him I had come up empty on this run, that I would explain it at the end of the day, that the second load was ready if he was. He looked at me for a moment with the particular look he used when he was deciding whether to push past the surface of something, and then he decided it could wait and went back to the loader. I had driven for Dutch for 2 years, and he knew when I was carrying what was not road trouble. And he also knew me well enough to know that I would say it when I was ready, and that pushing early was a waste of everyone's time. He was a perceptive man, Dutch. He paid attention to people with the same quality of attention he paid to logs and loads, not intrusively, but thoroughly. I made the second run that day and brought a clean load down to Forks, and I did not tell Dutch anything. I have never told Dutch anything, not because I did not trust him, but because there is a kind of information that needs to stay in a small room. And the room I had chosen was the one that had me and Connie in it, and no one else except eventually Ray. Dutch would have believed me, I think. He was a man from a country with its own folklore about forests and the things in them, and he had been in the Olympic Peninsula long enough to have developed an appropriate respect for what it might be holding. But I did not tell him. What was in the tree line was not my story to share, beyond the minimum number of people that keeping it required. Something settled in me over that spring, a question that had been unsettled since August, an ongoing question quieting toward an answer. In the early summer of 1980, I started paying attention to the Sol Duc Road in a way I had not paid attention to it before, which is to say with a purpose beyond the professional. I had been reading the road as a road for 8 years, reading it for grade and surface and load implications. Now I was also reading it for what it might tell me about the territory I was driving through, not the timber as a commodity, but the timber as an occupied place. These 2 readings coexisted without much friction because they used the same underlying attention, the same quality of watching, directed at different objects. What the second reading turned up over the course of that summer was more than I had expected. Movement at the edge of the timber that resolved, when I looked directly at it, into stillness. Sections of road where the soil at the edge showed disturbance that was not deer track, and not bear track, and not anything I had a name for. A length of vine maple at the corner, below the 291 junction, where a stand of vine maple had grown into the road cut, with a section of branches broken and bent in a pattern that was not consistent with a falling tree or a passing bear, and that I could not explain by any other means, except that a large upright shape had pressed through it. These observations did not prove anything separately. Together, across a summer of driving the same road, with both sets of attention active, they built a picture of a territory that was inhabited in a way I had not previously seen. The picture was not complete. I was getting it through a windshield at road speed, on a professional schedule, not on foot and not on my own time, and what I was seeing was what happened to be visible from the road at the moment I drove by. The full picture, the picture that included what happened in the old-growth sections above the road, and in the high drainages that fed the Sol Duc, and in the alpine territory above the tree line, where nothing human had gone in my lifetime. That picture was not available to me. I was adjacent to one edge of a territory much larger, and the edge was all I had. I was careful not to mistake the edge for the whole, not a full answer, but enough to understand that what I had done on the slope had been registered and had been weighed, and that the weighing had produced a result. I was known to them, and being known to them was different from being unknown. In May of that spring, Connie started taking over the preparation of the food. Her approach was more systematic than mine. She had spent the winter reading, through the library and interlibrary loans from the county system, everything she could find about seasonal food availability in temperate old-growth forest, about indigenous botanical knowledge of the Pacific Northwest, about what large omnivores needed through the different seasons. She built a rotation, dried salmon and smoked deer meat in fall and winter, fresh berries and fish and root vegetables in spring and summer, dried fruit and nuts through the lean months. She kept the food in the same kind of container, a waxed paper bag from the hardware store, left at the same base of the same fur, at the same hour every week. The consistency was her idea. She thought the pattern of the exchange mattered as much as the content. She kept notes on the food she prepared and the responses she received, separate from my practical log, more analytical in character. Where my log was dates and descriptions, Connie's notes were about patterns, about what the responses implied about diet and season and the kinds of materials available at different elevations, at different times of year. She cross-referenced these notes with her library research, with what she was reading about traditional ethnobotany of the Pacific Northwest, and about the seasonal behavior of large omnivores in temperate forest environments. After about 2 years of this, she had built a picture of a diet that was primarily but not exclusively plant-based, with fish being the most important protein source and large mammals being rare but present, and with a significant dependence on seasonal abundance, the runs of salmon in the fall, the berry crops in late summer, the root crops in spring and early summer when the overwintered starches were most available. She brought this picture to the food we left, adjusting it over time to more closely match what she believed the nutritional picture to be in each season. Fresh salmon when the coho were running rather than canned fish. Fresh dug camas bulbs in spring rather than the dried store. Dried huckleberries in winter, preserved from the late summer harvest, which Connie picked herself from the huckleberry stands on the ridge east of the property on her days off in August. This level of attention was, I think, what distinguished what Connie brought to the exchange from what I would have brought to it on my own. which would have been good faith effort without the depth of knowledge to back it up. She made it genuinely appropriate, genuinely matched to the actual situation, rather than to a generalized idea of the situation, and I believe that appropriateness was part of what the responses acknowledged. She was right. The responses became more consistent over that spring and summer, more varied in content but reliable in their presence. The character of the visits changed from the watchful waiting of the winter to the habitual, to acts decided and enacted rather than still being worked out. That summer, 1980, was the most active period in terms of the exchanges that I can remember in the full run of the 22 years. I think this was because by the summer of '80, the situation had become genuinely two-directional in a way it had not been before, because whatever had been determined about me had been determined, and the exchange was no longer primarily an information-gathering exercise, but a different mode of communication. The responses at the food spot through that summer were varied, suggesting not just the availability of materials, but something more like selection, a choosing from among available things of the thing that seemed appropriate for the occasion. When we left Fresh Coho in late June, the response was a cluster of dried, pressed berries of a kind that grew in the upper elevation meadows and were not available at the tree-line elevation. When we left a portion of dried venison in July, the response was a stone tool of the kind used for working hide. When we left dried camas root in August, the response was the bundle of medicinal plants that changed Connie's knee. I thought about what the selection logic was. It was not random, not the product of whatever happened to be available at the moment of response. It had an internal logic that I could only partially read, but the partial reading I managed suggested a reciprocity that was not transactional in the human sense, but was a form of attention to what had been offered and to what offering back would constitute an appropriate reply. This is a complicated thing to describe without making it sound more mystical than it was, so let me be direct about it. Whatever was leaving these responses had the concept of appropriate reply, had the concept that when an offering is made, a reply should offered back, and that the something offered back should be considered rather than arbitrary. This concept is not simple. It requires theory of mind. It requires the ability to imagine what another party is in relation to what you are providing. It requires the capacity to evaluate options against a standard. This is the thing I kept coming back to in those years, the complexity of what the exchanges implied, and the way the implication kept surviving every attempt I made to explain it more simply. In August of 1980, almost exactly a year after the incident on the slope, Connie found a bundle of dried plants at the food spot. She spread them on the kitchen table and spent 2 hours with her reference books. She identified 3 of the plants. 2 had analgesic properties recognized in traditional uses across multiple Pacific Northwest cultures. 1 was associated with supporting healing after physical injury. She had left us medicine, Connie said. Connie had been dealing with a knee problem since the previous spring, a persistent ache that her doctor had attributed to years of standing and carrying, and for which she had been taking aspirin most days. We made tea from the plants that evening, following Connie's best interpretation of the preparation method. It tasted like the bottom of a forest, strong and green and nothing else. Connie drank it and said it was possibly the worst thing she had ever tasted, and it was the most interesting thing that had ever been in her kitchen. She reported the next morning that her knee had been more comfortable through the night than it had been in months. I am not making a medical claim. I am telling you what Connie said. And Connie was a person who said what was true. We left twice the normal amount of food the following week. What we got back was a piece of obsidian worked more finely than any of the previous pieces. The edge pressure flaked in a pattern that a knowledgeable person I showed it to later identified as technically accomplished stonework from someone who understood the material. Through the early years of the 80s, I developed a practice that Connie had begun in the winter and that I eventually made my own, which was keeping a record of the exchanges. Not a diary. I was not a diary kind of man, but a practical log, dates and what had been left and what had been received, in a composition notebook from the school supply section of the True Value. I kept the notebook in the desk drawer in the shop, where neither visitors nor Connie's library colleagues were likely to find it, and I updated it once a week on Saturday evenings after I had checked the tree line and before I turned on the television. The log ran to 4 notebooks over 22 years, and when I sold the Forks property in 2019, I kept the notebooks and the 3 objects and nothing else of the material record of that period. Looking back through those notebooks now, what strikes me most is how regular the exchange became after the first 2 years. The initial variability, the nights when the sound was angry, and the nights when it was watchful, and the nights when it was otherwise, the unpredictability of when a response would be left and when it would not, all of that settled into a pattern that by 1982 was as reliable as anything in my working life. If I left food on Wednesday, a response would be there on Thursday or Friday morning. If I did not leave food, nothing would be there. The exchange had found its rhythm and was operating within that rhythm with the consistency of a decided thing and required no further decision. The truck sightings in the Sol Duc drainage continued through those years, though not on any schedule I could predict. They were gifts, as unexpected things seen in the forest are gifts, moments of a kind I had not encountered before inserted into the ordinary without warning or ceremony. I might go 6 weeks without seeing anything from the truck and then come around a curve on an empty run, and there she was at the edge of the timber, or there were both of them, doing whatever it was they were doing at the edge of the thinned stand before the truck came around the corner and interrupted them. I slowed when I could, and I looked as long as the road allowed, and I kept what I saw in the notebook and in the part of my thinking that had become devoted to this situation. In the summer of 1982, I came around a curve in the road and found her in the road itself, not at the edge of the timber, but standing fully in the roadbed, roughly 30 feet ahead of the front bumper. I put the brakes on, and the truck came to a stop, and we looked at each other through the windshield. For what I estimate was about 12 seconds. I have been in this industry long enough to know that 12 seconds of direct eye contact from a window seat on a logging road is a substantial amount of time, long enough to take in considerable detail and to have it stay with you. She was standing in the road with her weight evenly distributed between her feet and her arms at her sides, and she was looking at the truck with the same layered attention she had brought to the first look in the tree line, the same quality of directed assessment. The silver at her shoulders caught the afternoon light. The hair on her forearms was long enough to move in the slight wind that came up the drainage. She looked at the truck and at me in the cab of the truck, and then she stepped to the side of the road and was in the timber and gone quickly, not in a fashion that seemed frightened, but in a fashion that seemed decided, as though she had seen what she had come to see and was done. I sat at the wheel for a few seconds after she was gone. Then I drove the rest of the run to the landing. Dutch noticed a shift when I got back to the landing. He did not say anything about it, but his eyes tracked me as I got out of the cab and walked the binders. And at the end of the day, when I was putting the truck away, he came and stood next to me in the yard and said he hoped everything was all right at home. I said it was. He nodded once and went back to the shop. He had known me for 4 years by then, and he knew the difference between a man who was troubled by the road and a man who was troubled by other than the road, and he was too precise to misidentify which one I was. He was also too respectful to ask about it, which was one of the things I valued about Dutch. The years between 1980 and 1986 were the years I came to understand the full scope of what I was adjacent to. or as close to the full scope as I was ever going to get from my particular angle on it. I had one angle: the tree line and the Sol Duc road, and the exchanges at the base of the fir, and the occasional sightings from a moving truck. Whatever was happening in the deeper territory, in the high drainages and the places where no road went, I had no access to. But even from one angle, across 6 years of regular observation, certain things became clear. There was a calendar to the exchanges. The responses in fall tended toward materials with insulating properties, cedar strips that could be woven, pieces of bark prepared in specific ways. The responses in spring tended toward food, high-calorie things, the responses of a body that had come through a winter of reduced resources. The responses in summer were more varied: new materials, new preparations, objects I sometimes could not identify, even after showing them to people with knowledge I lacked. This seasonal pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. There were 5 sightings from the truck in the Sol Duc drainage between 1980 and 1986. 3 times the larger one alone, standing at the edge of the thinned stand or near the creek crossing, visible for a moment and then gone. Twice, both of them. The second time I saw them together was in the spring of what I estimate was 1983, and by then the smaller one was approaching 6 feet, and the proportions that had seemed outsized on a juvenile were settling into proportion. The arms were still long, the shoulders still wide, the hands still large. But these features looked like what they were: the frame of a body growing toward its full dimensions. The leg that had been pinned carried no visible trace of the injury. Whatever had healed cleanly. I drove that road through those years, and I watched, and I kept what I watched in the part of my thinking that was separate from the part connected to the radio and the sort yard and the daily business of a man's life. There was one other person besides Connie who knew any of it, and that was Connie's brother Ray, who drove equipment for a contractor out of Port Angeles, and who was a man I trusted with the few things I needed to say out loud. I told him the whole thing one Saturday afternoon in my shop. He listened through all of it with a beer in his hand, and when I finished, he said he believed I was telling him what I had seen and that he thought I had done right by whatever I had freed on the slope. He did not say he believed the story itself. We talked about a carburetor issue he was having, and he went home. He has never mentioned it again. In May of 1986, on a Tuesday night, I woke up to a sound from the tree line that was unlike anything I had heard in all the years of visits. It was lower than the familiar vocalization, lower than the wood knocking. It was longer, running out over 20 or 30 seconds, in a single held note before falling away and then coming back. There was a quality in it that I have heard in human voices at particular moments. The graveside voice, the voice of someone who has just received the worst news, the voice that carries what has happened, whether the person speaking wants it to or not. A quality of loss, not fresh loss, not the first shock of it. The older kind, the kind that has been carried far enough to be given a sound. I went to the window. The shape at the tree line was alone. I stood at the window for the full time she was there, which was longer than usual, the sound coming and coming back through most of it. When the shape was gone and the tree line was quiet, I went back to bed and told Connie in the morning. She sat with her coffee and said nothing for a while. Then she said the young one was gone. I thought she was right. The sightings in the drainage that summer did not include the smaller shape. When I saw the larger one through the rest of '86, she was alone. The visits continued but had dropped to once a month or less, and the character of them had changed in a way I noticed without fully understanding. Less duration, the sound shorter, the presence at the tree line briefer, as if the reason for coming this far from the deep timber had changed. I do not know what happened to the young one. The most likely explanation, the one I hold to because it fits the logic of everything else I observed, is that it moved on to its own territory, within whatever social structure applied to a population I had only ever seen the edges of. It had grown, it had healed. Whatever relationship existed between the two of them had eventually reached a point where separation was appropriate. I believe this because it makes sense within everything else I had seen, and because the alternative explanations require a loss I cannot verify, and I do not have evidence of that. The late 1980s were when the timber industry in the Pacific Northwest entered the period that Forks residents of my generation still talk about with a complicated mixture of anger and grief. The northern spotted owl listing, the litigation that followed, the federal injunction that stopped timber sales on national forest land beginning in 1990. The mill closures came fast in Forks and in the surrounding communities. The economic effect on families that had been in timber for 3 generations was not a soft landing. I had moved off the truck and into dispatching by then, which meant I still had work when many of the drivers I had worked with did not. The dispatch job paid less, but it was work, and Connie was full-time at the library, and we managed. But I knew people who did not manage. I knew people who left Forks because there was nothing left for them in Forks. And I knew people who stayed because they could not imagine leaving and could not find the new version of themselves that leaving would have required. It was a hard time in a place that had been built entirely on one thing. And when that thing changed, the place had to decide what it was going to be, and it was still deciding when I left in 2019. The effect on the forest was not only economic. The federal injunction meant the national forest timber sales stopped, and the roads that had seen daily truck traffic became roads that saw maintenance work and recreation use, and very little else. The upper Sol Duc drainage, the side drainages that connected to the deeper timber of the national park, all of it went quieter. The cutting stopped. The timber that had been in the pipeline went back to just being timber, growing, and the old growth sections that had been on the schedule went on being old growth. The forest that connected all of those sections had fewer machines in it and fewer people and more of itself than it had had in the years I had driven through it. I thought about that in those years, about what it meant for the territory of what had been ranging through that forest while the roads were active, navigating the machinery and the people and the changed landscape of a working timber operation, and what it meant for that same territory when the machines went quiet. The simplest reading was that less machinery and fewer people in the upper drainages was an improvement in conditions, and I hoped that was true. The 90s on the Olympic Peninsula had a particular quality for those of us who stayed. The shutdown of the national forest timber sales had been followed by a period of economic transition that Forks was not well equipped to make. A community built entirely on one industry, suddenly asked to become a different economy, without much in the way of resources or infrastructure for the becoming. Some families left, some businesses closed. The mill on the south side of town went quiet in '92, and the sort yard where I had been dispatching closed its Forks operation in '94, and I spent 18 months doing what work I could find before landing in a smaller operation out of Forks that was running private timber on non-federal land and could still operate under the regulations that had stopped the larger operations. The work was intermittent and the pay was less than I had been making, and those were not easy years in the material sense. What I noticed through those years was that the quality of the visits to the tree line was not affected by what was happening in Forks. She came when she came. The food was taken or it was not. The response was there or it was not. And the visits to the tree line were as regular within their reduced frequency as they had always been. The tree line did not know about the mill closure. The timber did not care about the sort yard. The mountain economy that what was in the forest was operating within had not changed because the human economy in the valley had collapsed. This disproportion was a recurring thought in those years. The way the two economies, the human one and the one I was adjacent to through the tree line, were in the same geography but not in the same relationship with it. We were in the forest, and it was in the forest, but we were in it in such different ways that the changes in our portion of it registered to us as catastrophe and to it as nothing in particular. Connie said once that this was what it meant to be native to a place in the deep sense, not just to have been born there, but to have been there long enough that your life cycle and the landscape's life cycle had become the same cycle. You did not notice a mill closure the way you did not notice a single year's drought or a single year's flood, because your time scale was long enough to hold those variations as normal variation rather than catastrophe. We were the visitors, she said, even after 3 generations of family in Clallam County. We were the short-lived ones passing through the landscape, and what we were in relationship with at the tree line was a presence that lived in the landscape on its own terms. I thought about this for a long time. I still think about it. The visits through the early 90s dropped to once a month, sometimes less. The food continued to be left and taken. The responses continued to come, more minimal than in the earlier years. A single piece of bark, one small obsidian piece, once a dried root I could not identify. The character of the visits felt like routine at a lower frequency, not abandoned but not central. Connie said it was natural. Relationships changed over time, she said, without becoming less real. The changes were evidence of a living thing, not a dying one. The years through the middle and late 90s had their own specific texture, the texture of a life that was quieter than it had been without being diminished. Connie and I had found our pace. The dispatch work I was doing kept me in contact with the road and the timber without putting me behind a wheel full time. And Connie had taken on additional responsibilities at the library, a local history project she was leading that involved interviewing longtime residents of Clallam County about their memories of the peninsula before the changes of the 90s. She interviewed Gus Hartley, who had sold the operation to a younger contractor and was retired. She interviewed Dutch's wife because Dutch had died in '93 of a heart attack in the sort yard, quick and without warning, and his wife remembered him with the clarity that long marriages produce. She interviewed ranchers and fishermen and a woman who had been a teacher in Forks for 40 years and had watched 3 generations of timber families come through her classroom. The project was published by the County Historical Society in 2002 as a small book, and it is still in the library. None of these interviews mentioned the tree line. I had not told anyone for whom telling would have been appropriate, and the information was not mine to add to someone else's history project in any case. But I thought about it sometimes while Connie was working on the project. The fact that the most significant thing that had happened to us in Clallam County was not in any record anywhere, not in any library, not available to any researcher who came looking for it. It was in 4 composition notebooks in my shop desk, and in the objects in a cardboard box, and in the specific quality of attention I brought to a tree line, I would not look at the same way for the rest of my life. Private is not the right word for it. It was more that it belonged to the situation that had produced it, and the situation had determined its own keepers and its own form of record, and what those were was what it had. Through those years, the visits to the tree line continued at the reduced frequency that had characterized the late 80s and the early 90s. I counted them in the notebooks: 9 visits in 96, 7 in 97, 11 in 98, 6 in 99, 8 in 2000. Each one noted, the food status noted, the response noted, if there was one. The responses in those years were less frequent than in the earlier decades, but continued to come and continued to carry the quality of selection that had characterized them since the summer of 1980. the choice from available things of the thing that seemed appropriate to offer. I received a piece of obsidian worked more finely than any of the previous pieces in the summer of '97. I received a bundle of pressed and dried plant matter in the fall of '98 that Connie identified as consistent with plants used in preparations for respiratory health. In the same weeks that I had a persistent cough from a chest cold that had been slow to resolve. I cannot say that was coincidence, and I cannot say it was not. I thought about that often in those years, what it meant for a being to be in a relationship with you across enough time for both of you to change within it. The early visits had been driven by urgency, by the working out of a situation that was open and required resolution. By the late '80s, that situation had long since been resolved. What remained was not urgency. It was older and slower, the kind of connection that does not require frequent contact to remain what it is, that persists in the background of the days it does not appear in because it has become part of the structure of those days. The tree line behind my house was never just a tree line after August of '79. Even on the nights nothing was in it, it was the tree line where that presence came. Connie kept the food rotation going through the '90s at the same pace, same time, same place. Whether the response came or not that week did not change the preparation for the next week. She did it as she did the things she had decided mattered, without drama, without ceremony, without requiring the other party to acknowledge that she was doing it. I have thought about this quality in Connie many times since she died, the quality of doing a thing because it was the right thing to do and not because someone was watching or because a reward was coming. She had it about everything she cared about: the library, the garden, the food at the base of the fir. She put in what the thing needed, and she left the outcome to the thing. In the winter of 2001, in February, I left food at the base of the fir on a Wednesday evening and came out in the morning, and it was still there. I stood over it for a long time, in the cold, looking at the untouched bag. Then I brought it inside. I left food again the following week, still there. The week after, still there. Through March and into April, nothing was taken and nothing was left, and the shape that had stood in my trees for 22 years was not in my trees anymore. I do not know what became of her. I have thought about this question for 24 years, and I have not arrived at an answer I can hold with certainty. She was old by any measure I could apply, old in the way that things that move slowly and manage their resources carefully are old, with a kind of solidity to the age that was not frailty. Whether she moved deeper into the range, whether the declining visits of the previous decade had been a gradual withdrawal for reasons I could not observe, whether an ending had come that I did not witness, I cannot say. What I can say is that the forest on the ridge behind my property was the same forest it had always been, the same second-growth firs that had grown through every year of my life there, and that the absence in it was a texture I felt rather than an event. The tree line was still the tree line. It was just not what it had been. Connie said, the morning I told her the food had been there 3 weeks running, that endings were part of the shape of things, and that the shape of this particular thing had been good, and that we had been trusted with it and had handled the trust as well as we could. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said things when she had thought them through before speaking. I agreed. I did not have anything to add. The years between 2001 and 2017 were years of a different kind of life, quieter in the specific way that a life goes quiet after a long presence in it has ended. I did not stop watching the tree line. I do not think I could have stopped even if I had tried. The habit of watching it had been part of my evenings for so long that it had become part of what evenings were, and not watching it would have required an active effort I was not interested in making. So I watched it, and the tree line continued to be the tree line, and the years went by as years go by when you are in your 50s and then your 60s, and the work you built your life around has changed around you, and the children you and Connie never had leave a quiet in the house that you learned to inhabit. We had wanted children and had not had them, and we had decided, without ever making a formal decision, that the life we had was enough, that what we had been given in the tree line and the years of the exchange and the work of trying to understand it was a different kind of fullness, one that was not a substitute for what we had not had, but was genuinely and entirely its own thing. Connie died in the spring of 2017. It was quick in the fashion of things that have been building for years and are finally quick when the moment comes. 46 years of marriage, and then quick. I stood at her graveside in the Forks Cemetery and looked at the mountains to the east and thought about a woman who had read every piece of botanical literature the library could acquire, who had made cedar bark bundles into tea and called them medicine, who had taken over the food preparation so methodically and thoughtfully that the exchange at our tree line had become the most considered correspondence either of us had ever conducted. She was the better half of what I managed to do right in this situation. She would have disagreed with that assessment, and she would have been wrong. I sold the Forks property in 2019 and moved to Sequim, on the drier eastern side of the peninsula, where the rain is easier and lavender grows along the highway, and the Olympic Mountains are visible to the south on clear days. I can see the ridgelines from my front porch, the dark timber below the snow line, the high places where the roads have not gone in my lifetime and will not go in whatever lifetime is left to me. I look at those ridgelines sometimes in the early morning when the light is coming flat and the air is still, and I think about a slope in August of 1979 and a sound from the brush below the road, and a young one pinned under a hemlock with amber eyes that were looking at me before I had finished descending. I have 3 things from the Forks property in a cardboard box in my closet. The bark with the thumbprint, the cedar bundle that Connie kept on the kitchen windowsill for over 20 years, and a cedar plank with carved parallel lines on its surface that I found at the food spot in the winter of '80 after I left the plank there with some salmon, and it was returned the following night with marks pressed into the wood. I have had these 3 things for decades, and I have not had them examined, and I am not going to have them examined. A thumbprint in bark and a bundle of cedar and some lines carved in wood mean what they mean because of what happened around them over 22 years. Remove the context and you remove what they are. What I am willing to do and what this story is say plainly that it happened, that in Clallam County, Washington, in the Sol Duc River drainage, there is a population of beings that science has not officially acknowledged, but that a log truck driver encountered in August of 1979 and had a working relationship with across the following 2 decades, that the young one I freed under a hemlock log grew up in those mountains and went on to wherever young things go when they have grown, that its mother came to my tree line and expressed her anger and her grief and her watchfulness, and eventually, over time, her acceptance, in a language that was not human and that I could only understand through pattern and repetition and the accumulated evidence of 22 years of exchange. I am 72 years old. My knees are worse than they were when they pushed me off the truck, which is how knees tend to go. I grow tomatoes with inconsistent success in the Sequim climate, and I watch the weather come off the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and I sit on the front porch in the mornings when the sky is clear, and I look at the Olympics, and I think about what lives in them. They are big enough to hold things that have not been found. This is not speculation or belief. It is a fact I know from direct experience. The upper Sol Duc drainage and the connected timber above it and the high elevation forest that links those drainages to the deeper wilderness of the national park is an area of several 100,000 acres, with fewer roads in it than were there in 1979, and fewer people moving through it on a regular basis. Whatever lives in those mountains has more room now than it had then, and more quiet, and if it is as intelligent as what I had at my tree line for 22 years, which I believe it is, it has adjusted to the changed circumstances accordingly. The Sol Duc Road is still there. I drove most of it once, in 2013, to drive it. The spur above the 291 junction was gated, but the main road was open, and I drove to where it leveled on the shoulder of the ridge and got out and looked at the drainage below and the timber above and the mountains visible at the head of the valley. The thinned stand where I had seen them in March of 1980 had grown in, the trees now 60 years old and the canopy closed. The corner a mile and a half below the junction where the binder had let go in 79 was just a corner in a road. I drove back down to the highway and went home. The mountains are the mountains. They have been what they are since before the first road was cut through them, and they will be what they are after the last road is taken back by the forest. What they hold is not diminished by our not knowing it. A man in a Kenworth W900 with a peavey and a come-along got to know a small piece of it. Across a slope and a tree line and 22 years of objects taken from a base of a fir and objects left in their place. I was not given that piece. I was not owed it. It came to me because of 8 inches of hemlock movement on an August afternoon and a chain of events that none of us had any particular plan for. A peavey and a come-along. A hemlock rolled far enough off a leg for the leg to come free. And then 22 years of a tree line in Forks, Washington, holding what I will be grateful for until I am done being grateful for anything. There is a particular quality to the morning light on the Strait of Juan de Fuca that I have come to know well in the years I have been in Sequim. It comes in low and flat off the water when the sky is clear, the specific angle of light that belongs to the latitude and the time of year, and it hits the south-facing ridgelines of the Olympics, showing the topography in high relief. The draws and the ridges and the steep-sided drainages standing out in light and shadow as clearly as if someone had modeled them. I look at those ridgelines in that light and I know, not romantically, not sentimentally, but simply factual, that what is in them still. The ranges are large and the populations in them are small enough to remain unfound by the kind of searching people have done, and the intelligence I have direct experience of is the kind of intelligence that does not want to be found and has been successfully not found for as long as anyone has been looking. This is not a cause for wonder in the way that wonder is usually described. It is just a fact, a large one. Connie said once in the early years of the exchange that we were living at the edge of something larger, and that living at the edge of it was not the same as understanding it. She was right about that. I did not understand it. I understood the edge I was at, the tree line and the food spot and the exchange, and I understood my own side of the exchange with some confidence. The rest of it, the full extent of what I was at the edge of, was not available to me and has not become available in the years since. I am at peace with this. Being at the edge and knowing you are there is not nothing. It is, in fact, a great deal. I have been asked in the years since I started telling this story to people whether I would do it differently if I had the chance to go back to that August afternoon and know what was coming. I have given this question honest attention each time it has been asked, and the answer is always the same. No. Not because the 22 years were easy, because they were not always easy, and not because I would choose to have the kind of knowledge of the mountains that this experience gave me over any other kind of knowledge, because I would not make that bargain since the knowledge was not mine to bargain for. but because what happened on the slope happened, and because the 8 minutes of PV work on the hemlock was the right thing to do regardless of what followed, and because a thing that is the right thing to do does not become less right because of the size of what comes after it. I was presented with a young one pinned under a log. I had the tools to free it. I used them. Everything after that was what happened next, which is all anything ever is. That is all of it. Every part I know how to tell, which is also to say every part I am certain of, and certainty about this particular story is the only thing I have to offer that means anything. I have been wrong about lesser things. I have not been wrong about this. The mountains are still there. What is in them is still there. If you are ever in Clallam County on a clear morning when the light is right and the road is empty, and the timber is doing what it does when nothing is disturbing it, stop and listen for a few minutes. Not for any specific sound. Just listen, as you listen when you are in the presence of what was older than you and larger than you, and not in any particular hurry about anything. It might not give you anything. Or it might give you exactly what it decides you are ready for, which has always been, in my experience, the right amount at the right time. That is what it gave me. I have been grateful for it since 1979, and I expect I will be grateful for it until I am not here to be grateful for anything anymore.